Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Avi Feingold, and I'm one of the hosts of Bonjour Chai. Before we begin today's event, I just want to let you know a couple of things. First, simultaneous translation is available and can be accessed by clicking on the globe icon for interpretation at the bottom right side of the Zoom window. We also encourage you to provide your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function, and we will respond to some of them as a special bonus segment at the end of the program. Today, we begin this event by acknowledging the land on which we live. The purpose of land acknowledgements are to provide recognition and respect to the First Peoples of this land. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We thank them for having cared for these lands and waters since time out of mind, and look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build these great cities together. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the Jewish Living Lab are jointly presenting this event tonight, this event of Bonjour Chai Live, which we will start in a minute. Because we are live here, but we do not, you will get to see what a typical podcast looks like. So there are times when we may pause for a second, say 3, 2, 1. That's just kind of how the sausage is made. We get to see sort of the behind the scenes of what happens. Hopefully we will be as smooth as we possibly can for you guys. But that's part of the fun, is getting to see what we do behind the scenes for this.
Or as I like to say, how the gefilte fish is made.
Yes, exactly. That's going to go on our t-shirts, I think.
Perfect.
Okay, you guys good? Alana,
Mm-hmm.
You got your water? I got mine. David, hello, everybody.
Sparkling water for me, always.
Sparkling water. 3, 2, 1. This is Bonjour Chai. The Chai means live edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Alana Zakon, both of us in Montreal, and David Sklar in Calgary. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk to Henry Green about Sephardim in Canada, and Alana and David actor-splain to me about their Jewishness and Jewish portrayals in Canadian arts. But first, Alana, David, I am so excited to be doing this, our first ever live show, and it's all due to the involvement of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So before we get to all our other topics, I really want to welcome Mohammed Hashim, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Mohammed, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
Excellent. It's always good to have fans on the show. So great to have you here. Can you start just by telling us a little bit about the CRRF and what you guys do?
Sure. I can give you the boring story of, we're a federal crown corporation. We're from, part of the Canadian Heritage Department. But, in reality, we were born out of an apology, and we live as a promise. The foundation was created during the Japanese redress agreement, which, when the government put Japanese Canadians into internment camps during World War II, took away all their possessions, sold them, used that money to pay for the internment camps, and then sent them off. In 88, the government apologized to the Japanese community and said part of the redress was the creation of our organization. And we have an endowment that was created, half of it by the government and half of it by the Japanese community, as a commitment to doing anti-racist work in perpetuity. So we're their promise.
Wow, that's I had no idea that it goes that far back, and but the way that you explain it, it just makes perfect sense. Yeah.
So, one thing that...
Before we go, I want to give a shout out to Yoni Goldstein, who's my brother, and who helped put this whole conversation together. So thank you very much, Yoni, for helping us all come together today.
Of course.
So then I'm curious right now, sometimes if we're going to start with how Jews fit into this whole conversation, because this is Bonjour Chai, sometimes I think Jews feel like they don't fit into the conversation when racism comes up, as if Jews don't count as a minority because they're sometimes perceived as white or white passing, and they're told sometimes in Canada, well, you're just a privileged majority. I'm curious where you and your organization sees Jews fitting into the race debate today in Canada.
Yeah, anti-Semitism is a major part of anti-racism work, and I mean, obviously, like this work can't be done without collaboration from the Jewish community, but also, to be frank, like I've learned some of my best activism from Jewish community members. I've had mentors that have taught me how to do anti-racist work for a very long time, and to be frank, like there's pillars in Canadian democracy who are Jewish, who have defined what human rights look like. As for today, yeah, I agree with you. I think that many of my friends who are progressive, who are wanting to be involved in progressive issues around anti-racism, sometimes feel isolated or targeted or distant or unwelcome. And I think that's a reality that that many people feel, and I'm not exactly sure how to deal with it, other than to try to live by an example by working in partnership with Jewish communities and making sure we create space intentionally.
Where would you like to see things go in an ideal world, just in general? Let's say in the next year, with all the work that you're doing, what do you think is the next step? Because the world is slowly but surely learning how to be more accepting and inclusive. What's your vision for your organization or for us here in community?
So look, I think that the country is going through a reckoning. We're understanding our responsibilities in a new and different way. I think Kamloops shook this country to the core to realize that the impact of what has happened, the foundations and building blocks that we built this country upon, hurt many people horribly. And I think the reality of grappling with that reality is something that we're all having a bit of difficulty. That doesn't mean just like people who've been here for 200 years, but that means new immigrants who came here yesterday, who are buying property and wondering whose land is it. My hope is, I have a fear that when we talk about racism, that people look at it as though it's a topic of conversation today and maybe not tomorrow, and that window closes. My hope is that we don't allow it to close, and that we create real public policy change that addresses systemic racism in many ways. We're doing lots of really incredible work on hate crimes. We're working with a number of different community groups, but we're also co-chairing a task force with the RCMP to create national standards, which is huge. Because to be frank, maybe a swastika on a synagogue is an anti-Semitic hate symbol that people understand. But, what if there's other stuff? What happens at Mois? What happens at Gurdwaras? Are those understood as hate symbols or not? This country, the Jewish Federation in Toronto, they have a research lab that's doing hate symbols and an inventory of such. A guy named Daniel Pennerton, I think his name is. And it's fascinating because, what they're looking at are new hate symbols that are not just anti-Semitic, but are hateful, and people don't know what that is. People can't recognize it. CTV actually played it in one of their news clips a little while ago because they just didn't know what a black sun was. So this is an evolving project, and I think that for us, making sure that it's a high priority for officials and government decision makers is important, but also making sure that we actually build programming and change laws and legislation that are going to impact people's lives.
One of the things that I find is the fundamental thing that one can do to bring people closer together and to start breaking down these barriers is literally to break bread with people. When you sit down for a meal and for a drink with people, there's a powerful moment that gets shared when you're doing something so human. I understand that you are a pioneer in this field, and you are often found eating in many different kosher establishments. First of all, what is your favorite kosher eating establishment, and how did it come to be that you said to yourself, this is the way to work through race relations with the Jewish community?
Yeah, I love Dr. Laffa.
Every time I pass by that place, I keep thinking oh, my Laffa's sick and I got to bring it to Dr. Laffa.
Yeah, but I mean,
yeah.
Where is that located?
Toronto.
right up after. It's an
Okay.
Eglinton area. But you know, like they, like the bread is incredible.
Yeah, they make a good laffa.
It's just incredible. But no, I mean, honestly, I think that particularly between Muslims and Jews, it's been incredibly difficult for people to build trust and to see each other's, honestly, a sense of humanity. Like if a Muslim opens up their mouth and talks about like Israel, that 2 minutes later there might be, hold on a second, is that person a friend or a foe? How's he saying it? Like what are they saying? What are they not saying? Like, you know, there's a level of hair that goes up in the back. And similarly, like you know, like Muslims who are pro-Palestinian will feel discomfort in talking about Israel or the Palestinian conflict. And I think that weighs heavily upon the entire communities in terms of, you know, looking at each other across the table and building a sense of trust.
Sure.
You know, and I think that, you know, I mean, I don't want to get into the whole thing, but like I honestly feel like, you know, being able to just hear each other and to recognize each other's truths in an honest way is a place to start.
But you did mention Israel, and that tends to be the sort of that touchstone that really brings out that division, specifically amongst the Muslim community and the Jewish community. This country, that means, you know, a lot to the Jewish people around the world, is sometimes so divisive. What could we be doing amongst both communities that can have more conversations around that very divisive issue that can bring us together and to find some more commonalities amongst each other?
I think being honest. I think sometimes people, you know, get together for like hummus and falafel dinners and talk nonsense about, you know, how Muslims and Jews need to get along. I think people need to come to tables and to talk about what's really important to them. And I think that doing so in a respectful manner. I'm not sure if you remember, but last year during, not last year, was it last year? I'm not sure. Last year in May, correct.
Yeah.
There was like everything
during the pandemic, time just lost all meaning.
Everything was kind of like blowing up all over the place, and there was
Literally
during the conflict. You mean?
Yeah. But
Yeah.
There was like I think there was this, I can't remember the name of the app, but it was like a radio app where you kind of call in. Clubhouse, and
Yeah.
they had that conversation that between
Went for like
Israelis and
4 weeks or something straight.
It was incredible.
Yeah.
It was the best model of conversation. I was glued to that thing. Like I heard, like the Palestinians are talking about their reality, Israelis are talking about their reality, and it was civil. People weren't talking over each other. They weren't listening to each other, talking to each other. It was honestly one of the best conversations I had ever heard, and it went on for weeks.
Do you remember that plan that we had that went nowhere?
We did Clubhouse, I think one
No,
time.
the other plan to do we were going to do a pop-up restaurant over hummus and call it the Chickpea Accords, because you can't argue with your mouth full.
Yeah.
You have big dreams.
I had big dreams. But
I had a dream where I was going to bring like 100 Muslim families together or 100 Jewish families together and get them to all like, you know, sit at each other's homes and like over 2 dinners and talk to each other. Listen,
let's start with a shish taouk at Dr. Lafa next time I'm in Toronto, and we'll invite some selected whoever is interested. We'll invite some of the Bonjour Chai listeners and some other people, and we can just let's get this going.
I'm down with that anytime. Thank you.
Excellent. It's an honor. Mohammed Hashim, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. All right, 3, 2, 1. We're not doing the live ad read. So the first Jews in Canada were actually Sephardim, who founded the Spanish and Portuguese congregation in 1768 in Montreal. These were traders and merchants who arrived in New France from London, mainly. These Jews were followed by Jews from Germany, Poland, Russia, Lithuania, and just about every other Ashkenazi land for the next 2 centuries, until Jews began to arrive from Iraq, Morocco, and other points east around the mid-20th century into Canada. Now, these Jews are the focus of our discussion tonight. How did they integrate? How have they fared in the intervening time? And what is their future in Canadian society? Now, before we get to our guest, those of you who might be unfamiliar with the terms I just used, right? So Ashkenazi is the term that we use to denote one who has ancestry from Central and Eastern Europe. And Sephardim are Jews that originate, broadly speaking, from the Iberian Peninsula, while Ashkenazim generally assume that anyone not Ashkenazi is automatically Sephardi, there is a significant third group that unfairly tends to get lumped in with the Sephardim, and that is what we refer to as Mizrahi Jews, or Jews from the East. Right? These are Jews who are from the Middle East and North Africa, but do not descend from the Sephardim from Iberia. And these Jews include Iraqi, Persian, Yemeni, Lebanese Jews, amongst many, many, many other groups. And with that knowledge there, I want to turn to these questions about Sephardim in Canadian society. And with us to talk about that is Henry Green. Dr. Green is the professor of religious studies at the University of Miami, the founding director of Mosaic, the Jewish Museum of Florida, and of Sephardi Voices, an audiovisual digital archive of Arab Jews. He has just published a book of the same title with Richard Sturzberg, and he joins us this evening from Miami. Henry, welcome to Bonjour Chai.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and letting me be part of the Sephardi experience, although I'm an Ashkenazi.
I want to ask about that right away.
Are you an Ashkenazi?
Yeah, you're the only Sephardic rep.
I'm the most Sephardic that there is over
Not
there.
Not even full. I'm curious what made you focus so much of your work on this topic, being someone who isn't Sephardic.
Right. I always feel like I've got to first tell a story about my legitimacy. So I had my DNA done, and I found out that I'm 2% from the Middle East, I'm 5% Iberian, and I'm 5% Italian. So before I moved in to Poland and became a Eastern European Ashkenazi, it seems that I was a Sephardi in terms of my DNA. But the reality is that Jews in Canada, I grew up in Ottawa, and I had a very strong Jewish education. And I go to Israel in 1970, and I find out that I know nothing about the Israeli immigrant experience. I know the Holocaust, but I know nothing about the Jews from North Africa and the Middle East. And I hear about a protest movement called Pantherim Shacharim, the Black Panthers, and I go, great, I can support civil rights in America as a Canadian. And lo and behold, I go to the protest movement, and I find out that there's Jews from Morocco who are protesting the discrimination of their parents and what they are going through. And I become a follower of Beton and these people who are very much committed to changing the discriminatory experience and being accepted as a Sephardi Jew. And so I learned, in fact, that my Canadian Jewish education was missing the other story of Jewish civilization.
I remember when I first saw that poster of the Black Panthers in Hebrew, which we'll put a link to in the show notes because it's a remarkable graphic. It really changed my entire perception of what it meant to be Moroccan or of Moroccan descent.
What was it? Golda Meir said, "Oh, they're not nice," and they made the alley somewhere in Jerusalem on one of the neighborhoods. Sort of say they changed it to the "We're not nice" alley, and that was a lot of the influence for the Black Panther movement in Israel. You know what? I echo a lot of what Henry, what you have to say. Growing up in my Jewish high school and elementary experience, we were not taught. We were taught solely about the Ashkenazim, the European experience. And then also when I lived in Israel too, there was so much that felt foreign to me and alien to me because so much of it was from the Mizrahi and the Sephardic experience. I'm curious if you just want to touch a little bit upon what was their experience when they sort of arrived to Israel in the 50s, sort of right after the creation of the State of Israel. What was the general experience of a lot of these communities?
So first, there is this kind of revisionist history that Israel was founded by just Europeans. This is not the case. Sephardi were involved also in the founding of Israel. And so what happens is that as Arab nationalism post-World War II is developing, which is really anti-colonialism, Jews are in a way ethnically cleansed. They, depending on which country you're from, Morocco is a very sweet story, where Iraq is a very bitter story. 150,000 Jews in Iraq, 1948. By 1951, there's only 6,000 left. They're expelled. They are denationalized. They come to Israel, and what happens? Israel has no resources. Israel has 650,000 people in 1948. By 1951, their population has doubled. By 1960, doubled again. And so no resources, what do? They put people into refugee camps. And so the Sephardi are put into refugee camps. And it's no different than the Ashkenazi, but the experience is very different thereafter because they speak Arabic. The Eastern Europeans speak Yiddish. So if you need a job in Tel Aviv, they go and get the Yiddish speaker. No one speaks Hebrew. And so what happens is the Sephardi are more and more left where they're in the Mabarot, these refugee camps, transit camps for months, and it turns into years. Then it's a question of Zionism. The Ashkenazi, who are in control, they figure they don't really know about Zionism, so they have to feel Zionism. So where do they send them? To the new development towns in order to protect Israel. So they go to Dimona in the south. They go up to Kiryat Shimona in the north. And so now they're in the places that don't have the schools, the educational resources. And so it turns into more institutional discrimination, not because of intention, but because of just the nature of Israeli society at that time. So, then I just want to mention one other thing, is that these people look Semitic. They look as an Arab. In addition, they don't speak Hebrew, they speak Arabic. And so Israel, which is dealing with security issues, it becomes in a way personal. And it takes a generation until these protest movements in the 70s, which begins to change the tide.
So, one might think, hearing this story, that the migration of Jews from Arab lands, broadly speaking, Sephardim, to Canada would be fundamentally different. Because if you look at the two major groups that started at the beginning of this migration to Canada, you have Iraqis and you have Moroccans, amongst many others, and I'm sure you're going to fill it in quite a bit more. Now, both of those are countries where French and France it wasn't quite Morocco was a protectorate. Iraqi Jews really had an affinity for France. They trained in French. You would think that when they make this migration to Montreal, to Canada in general, because many of the Iraqis are English speaking and they have a lot of British connections, that they would be much better integrated. And from what I see, because my mother is one of those people, wasn't necessarily the case. So what can you tell us about the Moroccan, the Sephardic immigration to Canada around that time that was unique to Canada specifically, both for the good and for, not so good?
So you first have to understand where Canada was. There's a number of scholars that have written about this. Jean-Claude Lascris comes about the third family in the late 1950s. And, there were admission quotas for Jews to go to McGill University. There were no Jews sitting on Protestant boards in Montreal. Jews were basically on the margins in terms of the society. And then you have, someone like, Harold Troper, who wrote The Defining Decade of the 1960s, and everything changes. But take, for example, the Moroccans. You're, Avi, partly Moroccan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So take, what year
I don't look it, I know, but...
But what year did your parents come?
My mother came in the late 60s.
Okay, late 60s. Okay.
Mid to late, yeah.
Okay, so the Algerians, they're citizens of France. They go to France.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the Tunisian Moroccans, they're not citizens. They're part of a protectorate. So they're saying to themselves, where can we go? They choose a French-speaking place. Mm-hmm. Montreal, they think it's great. I'm going somewhere that speaks French. But Montreal is an Ashkenazi Jewish community. And so Muhammad was talking about discrimination. So here you have Jews who are coming from Morocco to a French place, thinking that they're going to be integrated into a French society.
And they came at the exact wrong time, right? Because of the middle of the Quiet Revolution, and they get automatically associated with the Jews. And, if they had come 10 years earlier, right, or 10 years later, right, after everything had been solved or settled, so to speak, right, it would have been an entirely different, world.
Right. But the question is, how did the Ashkenazi Jewish leadership deal with this? their comment was, well, you come to the Ashkenazi schools and you learn English. And forget about we're a minority within a minority. We're just trying to, get some leverage here and, become one of us. And so, okay, so, you have a henna party. We don't want henna parties. There's Mamuna. We don't want Mamuna, It's like, in fact, we can't even sit with you during Passover because you're eating rice. I mean, and so what happens is it turns them off, and they become, in a way, more sensitive to the political issues that are going on at that time with the Quebecois. And they speak French. They want to preserve their heritage, their ethno identity. They want to preserve the language. They want to be part of multiculturalism that is growing. And it creates a huge conflict between Jewish and between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi. And so I asked Avi, what is your mother? What's her stories that she tells you at this time?
Well, so she was actually, in a good place to be dealing with this, simply because she actually, when she came in, she started working with JIAS right away with the neighborhood house service. So even though she was Sephardic, she was part of the integration process for other Sephardim. So she is able to straddle both of those worlds right away. But, growing up myself, I wasn't yet part of this mass integration, right? I'm of that generation that is the first generation of kids that grew up of quote unquote intermarriages, right? Ashkenazi Sephardi, right? And there were not many of us, although we know who we are. Whereas if I look at my kids' schools, I think
common, right?
75 to 85% of the kids in my kids' classes are Ashkenazi Sephardi families.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, but this is a generational change.
Exactly. So it takes that extra generation for it to be fully integrated.
It's
I mean, that was even a.
I was going to say, one of the ways you have to understand this is in terms of geopolitics and Jewish history. So, for example, I grew up in the 50s, 60s. No one ever talked about the Holocaust, the Shoah. Not until Elie Wiesel wrote Night did we start doing it, a generation later. Okay? But it took another generation to Schindler's List when we started to really collect the stories and become and appreciate, in fact, what this was all about in terms of memory and building educational models.
Now, from the communities that are not coming from a direct Holocaust background, right? We're talking about people who are coming from North Africa, from the Middle East. Because so much of our education, and I was a child of the second referendum, where we had these divisions you spoke of earlier between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazim, there was deep divisions even in classrooms in 94, 95. Do you found so much of our education was on the Holocaust? Did that help or hinder these communities as we were trying to come together?
Well, what I was trying to suggest here is that for the Sephardi, when they come in the 60s, they're fighting a battle with the Ashkenazi. And so it's taking one more generation in order to just have a voice and be able to set up institutions. And they have to do their own kind of advocacy in terms of their identity. And in the process of doing that, it still takes another generation until what Avi's talking about, where his kids and intermarriage and everything else going on. It's the same kind of thing. It's generational. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think one of the things that one really doesn't appreciate is how much multiculturalism, Canadian multiculturalism policy has helped. Because in doing that, it has given a voice to Ukrainians, let's say. It's given a voice to Syrians. It's given a voice to the Lebanese. It's also given a voice to the Sephardi Jew. And it's done it in a way that is really interesting, because my project, Sephardi Voices, is in the macro a story about human rights. That here are individuals who basically maybe were denationalized, people who lost their property, people who came and had to remake their lives and had to do it in a way in which the Jewish community, as well as the general community, was not really sensitive to it. Yeah. And so as they were able to do that, they also began to become part of this wider Canadian fabric and take on a Canadian identity, which is so much part of multicultural policy in Canada today.
Yeah, when you say this, I'm remarking on the fact that it used to be that Ashkenazim were weirded out by Sephardic foods, crazy, spicy, weird, and Sephardim was like, oh, this brown food that's just, we don't even want to deal with that. And we've gotten to the point where Ashkenazim think that everything that Sephardim do is exotic and really doable and really interesting, and having this renaissance of like getting into Sephardic customs and ideas that hasn't quite yet made the leap to the Ashkenazi, where Sephardim are interested in Ashkenazi culture and stuff. I think that will be an interesting change to see if and when that will happen. But I want to go to something a little more related to that, but a little more serious than the food and the cute customs. I'm thinking about this, and David brought in the idea, and you guys brought in the idea of the Holocaust and Schindler's List, and that these stories took a while to get told. How much, because the project that you're doing is essentially the telling of these stories that are incredibly important to know and to not forget, right? The idea of Sephardic Voices was, as you had told me, very similar to the project that Spielberg was doing in terms of getting testimonies of survivors. How much what do you think of this dynamic that for a while we couldn't tell these stories because there was so much Holocaust language and so much Holocaust discussion happening that we couldn't quite get to the point where we were able to tell these Sephardic Voices as well, these stories, because the landscape, the Jewish landscape in general, was so Holocaust focused. Do you think that there's anything there to that?
I think there's two different things. The first is that it's very hard when you've been traumatized to have a voice. It takes time to be able to heal. That's the best way of saying it, to heal. And when you're coming and you're speaking Arabic. That's your language, your first language. When you come, you're not aware of what these customs are about, because it isn't just that you're coming from Baghdad or you're coming from Casablanca. You're also coming from the Atlas Mountains. You're coming from an area in which you do not have the French colonialism. You do not have the education. And so it takes time to be able to feel grounded. And like all Jewish families, at least in my view, is that the parents sacrifice for the kids. And so they're trying to give the kids a firm grounding. And so one of the things that led me to Sephardi Voices, this project, was because when Spielberg did his Shoah project, 52,000 interviews were of Holocaust survivors. But there wasn't one of the Farhud, the worst pogrom in Baghdad in 1941. You didn't have interviews of Libyan Jews being taken to Auschwitz. So the Holocaust is not part of the Sephardi experience in terms of what we're learning. So Sephardi Voices for me was twofold. One was, as I explained before, to make it part of the Jewish narrative. But it was to give to the children and grandchildren the pride of the heritage of their parents and their grandparents in terms of the story of Jewish life in Arab lands, in Islamic lands, and to hopefully, over time, change the educational system that David was talking about in part, and other you were talking about. So the children, when they have a Holocaust survivor come to class, let's say, why can't they have a person who comes from Libya, or a person from Morocco, or a person from Iraq? And why can't that child and the school take pride in the fact that this is part of our heritage too? And it becomes something that in fact empowers and changes our understanding that the Holocaust is just not a European story.
Right. I want to go deeper into the book a little bit. Can you tell us some highlights that you went into? Because I know I went online and looked at the Sephardi Voices website, and there's some amazing testimonial videos and transcriptions and all sorts of stuff. Is it a reflection of that? Is it new material? What can we look forward to in reading this book?
So on June 2nd, we're donating, Sephardi Voices donating the Canadian collection, about 100 interviews to the Canadian Library Archives. And Irwin Cutler, the former Justice Minister of Canada, Mandela's lawyer, is going to be our keynote speaker. And what is it about? It's about again, multiculturalism. Here are stories. Here are portraits of people who experienced their displacement. Here are photographs that have never been seen before. And so what the book is about is basically taking their voices and then weaving it together as a narrative in terms of the displacement of Jews from Arab lands, and in the process, how they rebuilt their life. So let me give you one or two stories. So take Victor Mashal from Montreal. He came in the early 50s. What did he do? He set up an Iraqi club in the 1950s. So the Iraqis who were coming could feel connected to their heritage. So let me go back to someone in Britain, a man named Abdullah Dangour, who I interviewed at 96 years old. And so he said, I asked him, who are you? And he said to me, well, I'm British. I've lived here for 60 years. And then he looks at me and he says, but how can I deny that I'm an Iraqi? I've lived there for 3,000 years. Or you take someone like Lisette Shashua from Montreal, another Iraqi. And she escaped in 1971. And she talks about how she had to dress like an Arab, and they go to the Kurdistan area. And it's the Kurds who become their saviors and help them cross into Iran. And so it then reaches out to a wider audience. Look what's going on with the Kurds over the last few years in Iraq. And so it becomes a bridge. And what we're hoping with this book is that it also becomes a way for the people who tell the stories to become ambassadors in terms of inter-ethnic bridging, because they have similar experience to other ethnic groups. And so the book is a way to both provide a strengthening of heritage, but also a way to bring voices so people can share their stories.
I have to say, it's really fascinating, having ministered to the Iraqi community, that their story is so fascinating. This line that they keep repeating, which is very true and very moving, is that this is the first time in 3,000 years that there's no real Iraqi Jewish population. The Jews are not in that area, literally in 3,000 years. And it's very, very sad for them. And it's one of those stories that I feel like the larger Jewish community is not nearly as aware of as, for example, in Montreal or the rest of Canada, the Moroccan community and their stories, because their numbers are so much bigger and different. I'm very curious about, what do you see as trends in terms of when we think Sephardim? We very much think about Jews in Montreal. What are the Sephardic communities like in the rest of Canada, and what is their experience? Because they are likely much smaller in number and much smaller representation proportionally to the Jewish community. And I feel like Montreal is very much the exception in that there is so much, we're near parity with Ashkenazim and Sephardim.
Well, again, it's part of, the story of the Quebecois and the transformation in Quebec and Montreal. I mean, at one point, the Ashkenazi in Montreal were the dominant community. And then, as Lebec came to power and things changed, there were more for sale signs than crocuses in the spring. And it resulted in Jews leaving and going to Montreal, to Toronto. So Montreal has about, under 100,000 Jews, and about 1/3 are Sephardi, mostly made up of Moroccans, some Tunisians, Algerians, and Iraqis, little bits of Egyptians. You have a few Persians. Toronto has about 200,000 Jews now. About 10% of them, 20,000, are Sephardi. They also have a good number of Spanish Jews. Those are from northern Morocco, Tangier, Tetuan. And then you have smaller communities like in Ottawa. Ottawa has a Sephardi club. It has a few thousand Jews.
She's about to marry into the family.
Oh, are you?
Not
so-
me, but my brother's almost wife. They're getting married this weekend. She's half Lebanese, and her father's actually involved in that community, from what I
And
remember.
Elena, I understand you live in Calgary or somewhere, or
That's David.
David lives in Calgary.
David.
I will take that honor. Yes.
Okay, so do you have any Sephardi in Calgary?
That is a great question. I wish I could answer. I'm part of a synagogue, B'nai Tikva, here. I don't know what the Sephardic or Mizrahi community is like at all. I know we've had some Spanish Jews involved in our community, but I'm hoping you could speak to that more than I can, actually.
Well, I don't. I mean, I do know in Calgary you have a Spanish scholar who is Jewish, who was an Azareli fellow at Concordia and is now teaching at the University of Calgary. And she's Sephardi and teaching Sephardi heritage. I know in Vancouver you have a small community, but for the most part, it's really 3-4 places that have any kind of density where you can have a synagogue, where you can have some kind of community. But
Yeah.
but I think that the real sense of it is that there is a change going on, and let me explain what that means. Israel was 15%, 20% Ashkenazi Sephardi in 1948. Today, about 55, 60% of Israel is Sephardi. And so the future of our kesher, our connection between Israel and diaspora Jewry is going to have to become more and more Sephardi connected. And I think as we move forward in terms of our education and in terms of our connections, there's going to be more like what maybe what Avi was talking about, intermarriage between the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi. And with that will become a stronger connect to Israel in terms of the Sephardi. And I think that is going to put the Sephardi more on our radar. And it's going to play out in different ways in different communities.
One of my observations, having grown up in Montreal and witnessing the differences between both communities, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, is that I've noticed that more Sephardic Jews tend to be more observant in their religiosity, whereas in Ashkenaz community in Montreal, it's a lot more secular, even though there are religious pockets. And the way that I always understood that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that because there was a more recent migration, especially with the Moroccan community, they're probably doing more of what they did back then, in the same way that when Ashkenazi ancestors came, across on the boat, they were more religious, and then it kind of became more assimilated. So what do you see as the future of Sephardic North American life? Do you think that that is going to happen as well, and they'll become more secularized, or is there something specific to the Sephardic culture that you think is going to hold on to it for longer?
That's very insightful, Elena. Very, very insightful, because indeed, that's the way most sociologists and scholars look at it. One generation deferred, therefore the secularization process is one generation later. But I do think there is a big difference. In the Sephardi tradition, there isn't reform, conservative, and orthodox.
Right.
It's only the middle way. So in Israel, for example, of course, you'd go to a synagogue Saturday morning, but then you'd go to the soccer game in the afternoon. It was fine, totally accepted. So what you have is I think, a much more tolerance within Sephardi tradition of where the bookends can be placed. In the Ashkenazi, it's much more rigid, and I think that the Ashkenazi.
I would frame it the other way around. Actually, I think that because Europe has, and Western Europe has, a tradition of reform, right? Then Ashkenazim have this language of being able to say, well, I might go to Shul Shabbat morning, I might go to services Saturday morning, and then I go to work or I go to the game. That means that I'm reform. Whereas in the Sephardic world, you don't have this language of reform. And so you may be doing exactly the same thing, but in your mind, you are just as traditional or orthodox as the rabbi, right? That because there is no frame of reference for being able to say, well, that makes me an assimilated, or that makes me a different category of Jew. And what's fascinating about that is the rabbinic responsa, right? In the Ashkenazic world over the past 200 years is a push against reformation. And in the Sephardic world, because you have this, this flexibility, rabbis are basically saying, well, we want to maximize the ability for people to practice or to be, and that is really where the shift is. So I think what we're saying exactly the same thing, but I think the framing is that reform gives people that ability to be something else.
I agree with you. I think your framework is sound on. I think it also, though, has to do, as I said before, that Sephardi are a minority within a minority. And so the ethno-religious connect in terms of family, in terms of synagogues, is extremely important to them. So take Montreal, for example, Spanish Portuguese synagogue. It's extremely
I was
strong.
the rabbi there.
You know, it's been what, 250 years, you know?
Years, yeah.
And I think it's the cantor is Ben Lulu, who had come from Ottawa now. And so you have this incredible connection from one city to another city.
Well, he had grown up there. No, he was the protege of the previous cantor, who was the protege of Salman Amzalag. So he comes from that tradition of the
right. But he went to Ottawa,
Portuguese.
and now
and then he
there's
came
connect.
back. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. There's a connect here, and I think that what happens in terms of this the evolution, as it were, there's much more connectedness. And and this is why I think Israel plays a very big role, because you don't have American and Canadian Jews running to Israel in the way that you have the Moroccans, the Algerians, the Libyans. You know, over 50% settled in Israel, so that the Jews who came to Morocco, from Morocco to Montreal, let's say, they have so many cousins in Israel that they're going back and forth all the time. There's this connect over and over and over again. And so I, in fact, view it as very positive. I think the Sephardi community is going to get stronger because of Israel. I think because of their family connections, they're going to be stronger, at least in the next generation. There's going to be less intermarriage than in terms of the Ashkenazi.
So we've seen in the past couple of years more of a normalization between certain Arab countries and the state of Israel. And you have these communities, both Israeli and diasporic, Mizrahi, Sephardic Jews, who are sort of opening up and rediscovering their roots by either, let's say, going to Morocco, revisiting these places. Do you see this almost as a positive, where I think maybe the older generation sort of said, we were forced out, we left these places, we feel we want to cut all our ties. And the younger generation sort of says, we want to rediscover our roots and where you came from and our grandparents came from. Do you see this as a positive or as a negative as they reconnect with their former countries?
It's a great question, David. And I think that one can't be monolithic, because there's a very strong bitterness in terms of Iraq, where they were denationalized and lost their property. There's 3 Jews left in Iraq now. But in Morocco, it's very different. The king was very supportive of Moroccans, and they didn't leave with that same bitterness. And so what's happening is that there's pilgrimages that are going back now. So they're visiting the cemeteries where rabbis are buried. Djerba in Tunisia is a community which is still thriving with 2,000 Jews. So you have a very different experience if you're coming from North Africa or if you're coming from Iran or Iraq. 2 very, very different experiences. And the Jews who tended to come to Canada were more from the Maghreb, more from North Africa. And so you have this pilgrimage going on in a way that is growing as Israel is building more sustainable relationships with the Gulf states and places like Morocco.
All right, I want to wrap things up because I think that we're really trying to get all these things together that we can go on for hours and hours. Before we do that, you have an event coming up, first of all, next Thursday, right? In Ottawa.
Right.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes at the National Library. Is that open to the public?
No, it's a VIP event, but
okay.
I do have an event on June 8th at the Spanish Portuguese Synagogue. It's at 3 p.m. in which I will be talking about the book and also interviewing Edmond Elbaz, the former president of the synagogue.
And the book is available online, and we'll check that out. I do want to give you a couple of quick lightning rounds because you've spent so much of your time involved in the Sephardic community. Let's put you on the spot here. So what is your favorite Sephardic food?
I would say couscous.
Oh, excellent. Okay. What is your favorite Sephardic custom?
It's actually a Persian custom, which is on Pesach, and you get scallions and you just whack the out of whoever's sitting next to you.
Excellent. Do you have, I mean, I'm sure that there are many, many, and we can talk about all these turns of phrases in Yiddish and Yiddish sayings and proverbs. What is your favorite Judeo-Arabic or Ladino or Sephardic in general word or phrase that says something that you cannot otherwise say in English?
I can't say it on
Whoops.
Euphemistically? No, nothing.
No,
Right,
it's
okay.
you know, the wonderful thing about you know, when you swear in different languages, you do it in different kinds of ways. So in Christianity, you swear against the church, but in the Arabic world, it's family.
Yes.
And so you really can't say it.
Okay.
But they're very colorful.
Yes. Do you have a favorite Sephardic community, or is that like asking for your favorite child and you're not going to say anything?
I you know, for me, I would say the favorite one for me is Montreal, because I grew up in Ottawa, and so my first exposure really to Sephardi in Canada was through Montreal, and
I had meant Moroccan, Iraqi, Persian, Georgian, but
You don't
Montreal
ask
works
that.
out like.
What's your favorite type of person?
you're right. It's
Because
like
communities have specific cultures and customs, and you can be into Italian. Anyway.
Well, it's like
Yeah, I
asking
get
you
it.
if you were married several times, which wife did you love the most?
There you
know?
go. We're not
The
gonna
most
go there.
recent one.
Yeah,
that
of
note.
course. You know.
Henry Green.
It's obvious. It's got to be you. You're Moroccan. You're the.
Of course, yes. No. I don't even like Moroccans so much. No, I'm kidding. I'm allowed to because I come from that community. Anyways, Dr. Henry Green, it's been wonderful to chat with you. I hope we can have you on anytime we need to find out and be informed more of the Sephardic community in Canada. You're welcome here anytime. You can find links to buy the book Sephardi Voices in the show notes and to the event on June 8th, as well as to the work that Henry Green is doing. And as always, you can email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca to let us know what you thought. Dr. Green, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Excellent. So for our second topic today, we wanted to focus on a topic that's 3, 2, 1. For our second topic today, we wanted to focus on something that seems to be getting a lot of attention in general. We have touched on this in the past, but with Alana having just finished a play and David deep in the weeds of a stage play of his own that he is putting on, we thought it would be a good time to revisit the idea of Jewish representation in the arts because your minds are so focused into it. And tonight specifically, we wanted to think about this in how this dynamic plays out in the Canadian arts scene in general. Alana, you just finished Mazel Tov. Tell us about the experience.
Sure. Yeah, so I was just in a dark comedy called Mazel Tov, and it included a lot of different themes around Jewish representation. There was interfaith couples. My character was a presumably Ashkenazi Jewish woman who was marrying a Black man. So it kind of touched a bit on that. It touched a lot on anti-Semitism. And what I really appreciated, just going a little bit behind the scenes, is that all the Jews were played by Jews. And if you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast, that is something that I talk about a lot. I have learned many different angles from all the different guests that we have talked about this issue with. And I'll say that I've opened my mind a bit more, that if someone plays it well, if maybe they grew up around Jews, like when I did the interview with Mayim Bialik about her movie that just came out recently, and she told me Candice Bergen grew up amongst Jews and she was improvising Yiddish. I was like, okay, once in a while I'll let it slide. But for the most part, just as David brought up at the beginning of this episode, I feel like Jews are often really left out of the discussion when it comes to issues around race and ethnicity and representation. And I think that we should be bringing our voices to the stage. So my character and the character who played my father, we were both Jewish, and my director was Jewish. And
yet the playwright was not Jewish.
And the playwright was not, which is really interesting.
Quebecois, I believe, right?
He was French Canadian. And I remember him telling us in the very first table read that when they did the show in French, because that's how it first came out, it was a French play that then got translated to English for the production that we just did. He had a lot of Sephardic friends come see the show, and they loved it and were laughing because for them it was in their language. And now doing so, I almost wonder if I've never read the French version, but I was thinking like, how would this have translated in French? Were they just Sephardic Jews, or were they still kind of Ashkenazi? So I still have that question for him.
Was it still called Mazel Tov in French, or did they transliterate it to, Santé?
It was called Mazel Tov, but they changed the spelling of it. So it was Mazal Tov, Mazal, and then for whatever reason, it needed to be Mazel for our version.
It's the more
I spell it
Ashkenazi
with an
way.
A, but
So what I'm curious, and
Yeah.
I saw it. Did you find that the characters were written right? How did you find the your character and the character of of the person who plays your father in the play? Jews being written by non-Jews. Did you find that there was something there to work with, to deal with? Did you do you wish you had an opportunity to talk to the playwright or the director about these things, or did you find that there was enough there to
I mean, we actually did talk to the playwright quite a bit. The director was in direct contact with him. So if we had questions or things that didn't make sense, then he would fix it. But I actually found there was nothing that felt off to me in terms of the references. He did a lot of research, and what made him want to write this show was he had done a couple plays in the Jewish community. I don't know what they were. And he consulted rabbis and many different people from the Jewish community to make sure that everything that he wrote was ethical and it made sense and that the values were displayed. And I thought especially the father character did have like a lot of his personality, and things that he said reminded me of a lot of people that I've met in my life. And they're all different kinds of Jews. I've definitely met people who are exactly my character. I think that I have some things that I'm similar, and there's some things that I'm very different from her in terms of my Judaism, but
So I know you didn't see this, David, and so it's not entirely fair for you to critique, but maybe you, as an
I loved every minute that I saw.
What I'm going to ask you is, as an actor / director, can you critique my critique of what I'm about to say? I found, right, and this is not a slight on any of the performances at all, right? Because I loved your performance. It was great. It was wonderful. She's blushing right here.
Oh, thank you.
Anyways, but I found that the characters were written in a very one-dimensional way, right? That there was this like, oh, this is what I think a Jewish woman is going to be, right? Is going to be the shrill Jewish woman who has these like goes over the top at any moment that there's something goes wrong and her wedding is ruined, and and that was her representation. And your father, the representation of the person who played your father in the play, it was also this sage, wise man from Poland who has these beautiful things to say and who always brings wisdom and a little bit of wisdom in a chemical form sometimes, and the play's over, so I can spoiler right there. But there was a very specific roles written out for Jews, and I was like, that's the thing that I was having a hard time with, that led me to be thinking about this segment. I was like, well, when Jews are written by non-Jews, right, and people are written by people, right, because that's very different from playing people.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
That there's something that happens there that like maybe you're not quite living the experience and able to really write something that has real depth and dimension.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you a secret about acting is that you have to kind of forget any preconceived notions you have about like your take on those types of things.
So it has nothing to do with your performance.
No. I mean, no matter what my initial feelings were around that topic, like you have to literally forget about them because you want to service the story.
Yeah.
But I will say that we did have a lot of conversations around my character, specifically around, is she, too one note or too whiny, and is she coming across a bit in that way? And I know that the writer did actually add in some things even while we were rehearsing to give her more of that dimension. And my goal was to make her as like 3D as possible, working with the material that I had, because I did have those thoughts initially. Are people going to see her as just like a spoiled girl? But you also have to keep in mind that what she's facing in the story is insane, and that it's an emotional arc. But anyway, that's enough about me. We don't need to put my show under the microscope. Let's go to David.
I mean, someone even in who's listening right now sort of said, would either of you ever play a nun or a priest in a blockbuster, even though you're not of the Christian faith? hands down, they're paying, I'm playing, basically. I think that we brought up this question before. As long as you do the research, as long as you coming from a place of care and consideration, as long as you don't make it, as Avi described, one-dimensional and shticky in a sense, then absolutely, I believe you have a right to play it as well. I'm gay as well. I've seen straight people get up on stage and play these characters who are gay. I've had artists who are very upset, and they're sort of describing and sort of says only people who are queer should be playing queer roles. I happen to disagree with that. I think you don't have to be Jewish to play a Jewish role. You don't have to be gay to play a gay role, as long as you put in the effort, the research, and the commitment to those roles and what they're after. That is what we want to see on stage.
One thing that I'll say though is that I think that and correct me if you disagree, but I think that there is a difference when we're just talking about religion versus talking about ethnicity, and there's a wider conversation to be had about Judaism not just being a religion. We are an ethno-religion. So while one can convert into Judaism, I think there's something to be said about the baggage, for lack of a better word, that we carry on our shoulders, and that is the part that needs to be represented accurately. And so I actually have played nuns before, not in a blockbuster film, but I have played them on stage. I've played Muslims even, but I was told like years later that the director who cast me in that, which was back in school, probably shouldn't have done that. Like, I wore a hijab, and I actually went into the Muslim, they had like a girls kind of hangout, and I interviewed them, and they were all excited that I was going to be playing a Muslim, and they showed me how to tie the scarf, and they showed me how to do everything. And then years later, I wore the scarf, doing the monologue in front of a panel of people. And they were like, you should probably not do this. And that was, before we were having these conversations more publicly. And I was like, yeah, I guess that's true. So,
and that's changed recently. And that's changed.
Yeah.
That has changed in several years. So I was touring the show for 5 years on and off throughout Canada and the US, where my co-star is Colombian, but she played a Muslim teenage girl. And we would tour the show, and there was sort of never any discussion. And Muslim girls would come up to her and says, oh my God, we love how you portrayed us. You portrayed us so accurately. We loved it. But in the last few months of our 5-year tour, there was pushback, and that was the first time. And that's where we started to clock this type of change that was happening, the conversations that were taking place to be like, can you play these roles? And it sort of shook us away to sort of say, what can you play and what can't you play?
Are there roles that you can think of within the recent past or even further that are great examples of Jewish representation in Canadian arts and Canadian plays, especially ones written by non-Jews, or the reverse? Like, is there a role that you have seen in a Canadian film, where you were like, oh my God, that should not have been written like that, or that was a bad representation? The actor,
like a recent one, you're saying?
Something, I don't know. What sticks out in your mind?
Most of the time these days, Jewish content is written by Jews, in my experience. What about you, David? I don't see that happening a lot on screen.
Probably, I would concur. Most Jewish roles have some kind of Jewish say in it, whether it's directly or secondhand or shown it around, because Jews exist in the media business. Let's not pretend. Like, there are Jewish playwrights, there are Jewish screenwriters, there are Jewish actors. And I think as long as you do the work and you sort of submit it around, I think it's easy to sort of get that honest feedback.
Do you think then that, if you're Jewish and you're writing for a couple of roles that are specifically not Jewish, you should ask, for not just for input, but like, at what point is it like input,
like a different religion, a different ethnicity,
something
or
else? Yeah, like I'm saying, if that's the case, and Jews should write Jewish roles, maybe a Jewish writer should only write Jewish roles, and you should have like a plays written like by a team of people, because the Jew shouldn't write the nun role.
Here's a question.
I'm curious, because you write this, David. You write stuff all the time, right?
Well, here's the thing. I've been working for the past 2 years on a script that really heavily focuses on a Mizrahi female role. Right? Am I allowed to write that from my Ashkenazim perspective? So I knew with that, I had to do the research. I had to interview Mizrahi people. I had to get information to be like, tell me what it is.
Did
I had
you
to
dress
show
in
my
drag
script.
and like go to a Mizrahi shul for 4 years on the other side of the mechitza, so you can?
Is that like method writing?
Method writing.
Mm-hmm.
You can only do you do the work you have to do, and I think at the end of the day, someone might still be upset and sort of says you didn't represent it correctly enough. But what I've done is I think I've done the work where I have researched, I've interviewed, I've exposed the script, I've had rewrites based on feedback from what I've done. Do I have a right as an Ashkenazi Jew to portray a Mizrahi female character? I think I do, and I'd love to hear more feedback in the future from it.
I'm going to bring up another topic that I'm curious to see if this has affected you, David. Maybe we've talked about this in the past, just off air. Is that a lot of Jews that I know who are in the acting industry have often been typecast as ethnically ambiguous in the past. Like I had a teacher who honestly looks a lot like my dad. My dad's side of the family, we are Ashkenazi, but he has darker skin. I get a bit of it from him. His skin's even darker than mine. And my teacher for years and years and years said that he was known to his LA agent as the guy who could do every ethnicity. They were like, we'll send you out for Mexican, Spanish, Italian, whatever. And in my own life, people always would ask me if I was their ethnicity, not just like random people who were like, oh, are you Persian? I would have Persian people asking me, are you Persian? And Italian people. And then all of a sudden, it's now shifted to saying, okay, unless you're actually those things, then you shouldn't be playing these roles, which honestly is super, I get it and it makes total sense. But what happens now is that as someone who, like a lot of Jews do not identify as being white because of the social connotation of what that, you know, being like from a WASPy background or of like a privileged class, which is usually what the connotation is. And there are many light-skinned Jews and there are many light-skinned Sephardic Jews and many, you know, it's become a strange place as a Jewish actor because you kind of get labeled as white.
You absolutely, it's so complex. I even actually just shot out an email asking about clarification from this because there's a big movement underfoot that we want representation. We want BIPOC voices for these roles. You know, we have something in Alberta called the 3550 initiative where we want the appropriate representation. And I would sort of say, a lot of companies would sort of say, we need the exact appropriate representation. But for Jews, that doesn't count. We're going to hire someone exactly from this particular background. So, you know, we're looking for someone who is specifically Métis, who grew up in this region. Yeah. And then we have a Jewish role. Oh, well, we all kind of get what Jews are like, so we don't really need to cast a Jew for it, but you're going to spend so much effort trying to find the other person's background. It's almost like Jews don't count in this day and age. And I really think there's a complexity for our Jews white, you know, even our Ashkenazi Jews white. There is this question where I think a lot of Jews that I've spoken to over the past 3, 4, 5 years are like, we're ambiguous, we're white passing, we're white until they say we're not white, and then it's sort of taken away from us. This is where I think like Jews don't fit in easily to this kind of box. And I think a lot of people are into this category. And I was like, I don't think we fit easily into, I think we need to sort of say it has to be more nuanced.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I've gotten so defensive about this that I just try not to like assume that I would fit into any type of BIPOC space. And I'm like, nope, that's not my place. Nobody has invited me and I'm just not going to stay there. And then I went out for coffee a few months ago with this Egyptian director that I've worked with. And he was like, oh, you should join this BIPOC group on Facebook. And I'm like, but I'm not BIPOC. And he was like, but you kind of are. And it was really interesting.
No, but you're not. You kind of are, but you're not.
It was really interesting to hear someone who's Egyptian tell me that. I was like, oh, that's kind of affirming, but I still don't know if I'm going to join this group.
Similar experiences on my end. You know, people from different backgrounds, Lebanese, have sort of said, yes, but you fit, you belong with us. And I was like, ooh, I've been told I don't belong because of how I'm perceived and what I look like right now.
So here's what I hope, and you know, you guys know I'm Mr. Contrarian. Sorry, Rabbi.
Of course
Contrarian.
you are.
I just, you know, that I have a hard time with this, and that I want to be able to support actors to be able to say you are, you know, you're able to play what you should be able to play, short of, you know, prosthetics, right, to give you, you know, eyes that make you look more Asian, right? That I think there's a problem with that.
We're very beyond
right?
that.
Like I think that's, you know, we can draw the line in certain places, and I'm not sure where exactly that's going to be. But I think that with Jews being the people that are the ones that are being perceived as ones who can code switch, I'd like to hope that this is the example that breaks the entire mold, that you need a Métis person from a certain region to be able to play that thing, and you need you know, somebody from the Caribbean, but only from a certain country in the Caribbean, because that's what the role is. And the idea that you said that like actors should be able to play roles if they feel like they are qualified for it, and that they think that they can bring it along. Not if
it's like a different ethnicity.
No, so again, so that's there are difficulties absolutely there. But you know, if you were given a role for somebody that was, you know, that was biracial, and said, and the role, the script explicitly said that this is a person who is biracial but looks fairly, you know, Caucasian, right? Very, very Caucasian, and really passes. And, you know, there's nothing about the role and the presentation of the role that says that you have to actually be biracial, right? So at some point you're going to start asking yourself, well, maybe that means that certain people, right? I'm not sure where that line goes.
I probably would not feel comfortable doing that audition, because I've been privy to hearing so many conversations in the arts about how people of those ethnicities feel about those roles being given to people who aren't, and they are the reason why this conversation is so dominant right now in the arts and culture sphere, is because for so long people of color were not given opportunities to play anything other than stereotypes, and now that they're being able to play leads and they're actually getting seen, who am I to take that role away from someone who's actually biracial?
To me, it sounds like it's the work of the writers and directors almost, and less the role of the actors, right?
It's actually more the casting, and then director who gives like the final seal, on the producers.
Right. So the responsibility is on the writers to make three-dimensional characters that are not stereotypes simply because they are the African American or they are the Asian character.
100%. That plays a huge role.
But if we get to that point, I mean, like I said, we don't want just Jews to be playing Jews. We're okay with non-Jews, as you said, right?
Yeah.
I know we differ on nasal, right? But we'll table that discussion. And you don't feel bad when somebody not Jewish does that, and you're okay playing somebody that isn't Jewish.
I don't feel bad when someone not Jewish plays someone Jewish.
Yeah, you don't say
I do
all the time. But you were the one that said if they play it and you think
if they do it well, that how rare it is that they do it well.
But Alana, are you upset because you want the role as an artist, as an actor, or are you? Are you sure
she likes Mrs.
Yes, let's be honest. Let's be honest.
Because Tony Shalhoub actually does a good job.
So Tony Shalhoub gets the exception, but I think we have to be honest. Sometimes as artists, it's like we want to play these roles, right? We're all want to work and we're all desperate, and we have to check ourselves to sort of say, are we saying this because we feel that way, honestly, or because we want the work?
Oh, I'll think on that, but I don't think that's my perspective.
I think that we should be able to move beyond that and to say if actors are really like to go back to the beginning of where we were talking. If you really feel like you're not necessarily, and again, I don't want to get into critiquing the author, the playwright, whatever it is, that we want to move on. But if your job is to be the clay, right, the work of the director and of the playwright, then no matter how poorly written or whatever it is, your job should be able to do that, whether you're Jewish or not, whether the other character is Jewish or not. And we should be able to get beyond that, again, with the bracketing of ethnicities, which is its own separate discussion. That's my deal with that.
We'll keep this discussion going for many episodes, I'm sure.
Absolutely. David, you have anything to wrap up as you are doing all this casting for your own stage reading and discussion?
We're doing a reading at the synagogue next week for a play called Facts by Arthur Milner, and I was sort of thrust upon me to put in charge to cast this thing. As an actor, I cast myself in one of the roles as one of the Israeli settlers, but then we have a Palestinian police officer and an Israeli police officer, and we talked amongst ourselves as a group with the playwright. Do we need these people to be exactly as they are, the characters in the show? They felt very flexible about these things. So we reached out, and I think it was important to all of us that someone from a similar background is playing the Palestinian officer. I asked a group, do we know any Palestinian artists in the city of Calgary? I couldn't find any that fit this demographic of this age range. So we did widen the net a bit to find someone who is Lebanese/Armenian who's going to play that role. And I think that was important to all of us, that we weren't just going to have some off the street, typical white person to be thrust into this show. I think we wanted to draw those lines.
Makes sense. I hear that. Well, good luck with it, and
thanks.
Can't wait to hear about it when it's done.
Yep.
Now it's the time in our show where we like to talk about our nachas of the week, that thing that made us feel good and Canadian and Jewishy over the past week. David, what's been your nachas?
So we were talking about this before with our guest. So I'm giving it to the city of Meknes, Morocco. This past week, dozens of Jews traveled this week for the first pilgrimage of its kind since the 1960s, after the kingdom restored the city's Jewish cemetery. The cemetery was founded in 1682, and one young rabbi who was there visiting Morocco for the first time sort of said, "It's a huge source of pride to come to this city of Meknes in the footsteps of our ancestors who rest here." So shout out to the city and shout out to the country of Morocco.
Alana, what's your nachas this week?
Mine's going to be not to a city, but to some individuals, to my brother Daniel and his fiance Hannah, who are avid listeners of the show. They're getting married this weekend. I'm very excited.
I believe Hannah's our first 3-time shout out then.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking that. There you go. Three's company, but I guess it's good in this case. Mazel tov, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All the mazals.
Excellent. I am going to give a recommendation. And because we started every segment, I believe, except for the actor segment, dealt with food. And we keep talking about this idea that Ashkenazim are they now finally have cracked the code on Sephardic food, and they think it's cool and exotic and spicy or whatever and all that. My recommendation is that Sephardim should really get into Ashkenazi food.
Good luck.
But that's the problem, is that as long as there is this denigration of saying, "Oh, this brown, gross food, I don't want to have anything to do with it," there will always be a split, amongst the people. And I think that if you open your mind a little bit and see what the other people are eating, and with a truly open mind to say, "Hey, what's this chopped liver all about? What are these gribbinus going to be going for?" And there's something wonderful about a fresh, batch of
gefilte.
You know what gribbinus are, David?
I actually don't.
Sounds really gross.
Do you know what chicharrones are?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's Jewish chicharron, right? Where you take chicken skin and you deep fry it. So you take fat and you fry it in more fat, and it ends up super crispy. And
I'll stick to the pork rinds.
I was going to say,
go ahead.
So my cousins are half Ashkenaz and Sephardic, and my aunt has kind of found a blend between all the different cuisines, and her Shabbat meals are very much both. She's taken to making cholent instead of dafina, but what she does is she adds chickpeas into it to kind of give it the Moroccan flavor. And then I don't know if this is just my family, or it must have not just been my family, but we have a different type of gefilte fish recipe that's actually peppery. So they're these big kind of peppery bulbous pieces of gefilte fish.
You have spoken about the peppery gefilte fish in the past.
The people here, they don't know. I'm telling them
on the podcast you have.
No, I know. I'm talking about these people on the slideshow.
I cannot wait. I want to finally taste.
It's really good.
Peppery gefilte fish.
And so there are ways of bridging it. And she also has her salad cuite, and she has the Moroccan things. And I think that's the way to do it, is you actually just do both.
Yeah, I
perfect harmony.
couldn't agree more. But I do believe that Sephardim should be opening up their minds and their palates to Ashkenazi food, not all the time, but at least, welcome that into the, because that will really bring a much closer blend of the cultures. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week of May 27th, Shabbat Parashat Bechukotai. Our producer is Michael Freeman, technical production by Andre Goulet. Our music is by So Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. We thank the great folks at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, including, but not limited to, Mohammed Hashim, Neil Santamaria, Ohana Oliveira, 321, Ohana Oliveira, and Suveka Priyatharsan for all of their 321. Suveka Priyatharsan for all of their tireless work on this project tonight. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please do tell a friend about Bonjour Chai, as well as the work of the CRRF. I'm sure they'll like it too. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca. I'm Avi Feingold.
I'm Ilana Zakon.
And I'm David Sklar.
And as a special bonus, we're going to start getting some questions. Our producer, Michael, who is not going to read them out loud. Michael, do you want to read these questions out loud for us? Maybe not. But we'll start reading that. So we have a question here. How can Jews navigate between so many different stories, Yemeni, Iraqi, Moroccan, Ethiopian, European, and make them heard in a foreign country like Canada? How are these stories welcomed in Canada?
Avi?
Well, I think that once you recognize that there are so many cultures that have so many stories, I've been reading this book that I just started reading this book called Rabbi on the Ganges, and it's a rabbi take around. He's a professor, and his name is Alan Brill. He writes, he's a professor at Seton Hall University, and he writes about his experience spending a year in India and explaining Indian culture to Jews and making this connection together. And when you realize the amount of cultures and amount of languages and amount of religious ideas that come out of India alone, right? Jews are, it'd be the easiest thing in the world to stop and think about this, right? I think it's hard for somebody to hear all of this that's happened tonight, or that, you know, what's going on within the Jewish world, and to say, oh my God, how am I going to wrap my head around it? You don't necessarily have to, right? The same way that somebody who's not necessarily interested in every country has to go and wrap their head around everything. If that's something that's interesting to you, you will naturally gravitate towards it and start, you know, absorbing and dealing with some of these questions. But if not, right, just try to get the broad strokes and figure out what's going on.
I also think that Sephardi Voices website is an amazing resource. They have all their interviews there, and they have a resource section with films that you could watch, documentaries that have to do with specific Jewish ethnicities. So I would recommend checking that out as well. Oh, my eyes are terrible. For Sephardim, to what extent does speaking French or English matter when arriving in Quebec as a newcomer? Do the kind of Anglophone, Francophone divisions exist also between Sephardi and Ashkenaz communities? Yes, from my experience, but I'd love to hear your take, being someone who's half-half. But when I was in high school, I was actually shocked at how divisive it was, because in my elementary school, which was in the West Island and in Dollard, there were some Sephardic kids in my grade, and like everyone got along fine. And then I went to a school in Saint Laurent, and it was intense. And I got called names for being Ashkenaz. I got called like gefilte fish and like Ashki. Not just me, a lot of people. And I was shocked because I didn't know that there was like this almost like racism within the Jewish community. I was like, we're all persecuted. Can't we all just get along? You know, as I've gotten older, I don't see that as much, but hearing the backstory, I can understand why if Sephardic people were coming here and there was an Ashkenaz majority and they felt like they had no voice, maybe it kind of turned into this tension, which I think we need to address.
I mean, I felt it, and it was because of the politics of the time, right? Growing up during like the height of the second referendum, there was that division and that tension in our school. I think, I could be wrong, I think it's different nowadays.
Yeah, I think I'm of the generation that lived through this transition period where we made this shift from Ashkenazim, who basically lived in Montreal but didn't speak French at all, because they were of that generation where we were Anglophone and the Sephardim were the Francophones, right? I remember coming up with this joke. I'm like, French immersion, it's more than just a Sephardic mikveh, right?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, I know, very inside, whatever. But like, I think we're at the point, and correct me if I'm wrong, where those divisions don't exist nearly as much anymore, where Ashkenazim are basically bilingual, just about everybody.
Yes, that is true.
There are still Sephardim that are mainly French speakers and are not fluent in English, but that have a passing English, and you know, and that will come with time as well.
Do you hear any you said before that in your kids' school there's a lot of people who are half, but have you heard stories from them about any type of tension?
Especially recently with the passage of the bill.
Myself.
Oh, 3,
no,
2,
I'm kidding.
1. I don't think anyone heard any of that.
Oh, okay.
No, I said I'm not going to say anything for fear of incriminating myself, but or the school, but it's not really true.
Do you think anything's going to change, Avi and Alana, with the passage of that new bill in Quebec? Like, will these old tensions come back and affect the Jewish community?
Look, I think that the people that didn't care about it left with Bill 101. That cared, you know, that had these huge cares, and I don't think that you're going to see the same mass migration. The people that are here have integrated, and look, this is Canadian politics and not necessarily Jewish politics, but I think that the Legault government was very calculated and realized that this law is going to pass regardless, and that it didn't matter, and that the people that were going to protest were really only going to protest, you know, not necessarily with their feet, and it wasn't going to affect the rest of the country. And I think that that is true for the Jewish community as well. I think that the people that are here are going to protest about it. They're going to complain about it again and again and again, but we are really not really going to, you're not going to see a demographic shift. You're not going to see a migration to Ontario with Bill 96. It's just going to happen.
Alberta still has cheap homes, folks, in Quebec, if that changes your mind.
So we have a last question. This is a question asked by many communities, but can you speak to the importance of being represented by members of your own community in a play or a movie? I think we touched on that quite a bit. Did you have anything you wanted to add, David?
No, I will stick to, I hope it's the same thing I said before. I think if someone addresses the show and it comes from a place of respect and it comes from a place of work. I was doing a show, very Jewish show, where the lead wasn't Jewish at first and was really struggling along, and I don't think had done their homework and had asked these important questions.
You said a Jewish at first. I was like, oh, and then they converted in their process.
Well, it turns out actually their grandfather was Jewish, but they grew up not a lick of being Jewish one bit. They were interested in the show, but I don't think they had done their homework enough or asked these questions, and they were struggling. And I think they felt the pressure on them to be like, oh no, did I bite off more than I can chew? So it's just to do that background and ask these questions. And I think many people would be very open to answering and helping and making sure that it is represented in a very respectful way.
And I'll say also that I think there's a very wide variety of answers to this question. I don't think that we all have the same feelings. And as I said before, I feel conflicted on this one. I think ideally they would be represented by members of our own community. But if it does happen, and it's not like we're not in control of it, it happens, I would hope that it's being portrayed well.
Yeah, you guys know my proclivity to extreme examples, right? And and how those things never, right? They're not designed to be about extremes, but about thinking about the middle ground. What I don't want to see, what was that film that came out a few years ago where the director used his son for a whole bunch of years as the kid was growing up?
Oh, Boyhood?
Boyhood, yes.
Yes, a great.
Who was the director again?
I don't remember, but it's a
Linklater?
great movie.
Richard Linklater, exactly, yes. So I don't want to get to the point where we have a screenwriter and or a playwright that says, here is a play that I've written and it is fully realized and it has 20 actors in there and they are all very different ethnicities and backgrounds because this is important to it. But in order for you to really embody this character, you have to have grown up on this street, right, in this neighborhood to really get it, right? And so not only that, but in a certain period of time. So we are only going to either find actors or I'm going to raise actors, right, that grow up in certain neighborhoods for 20 years.
Actor
so that,
farms, though.
Actor farms, so that we can say that, we have placed this actor and that this play took 20 years to
That's
produce.
like the Truman Show.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to get to that point where the only
that might
person.
be your wildest idea you've said on the show.
For sure. I'm not
I think these
arguing
questions
that.
are all going to be. I think these questions are all going to be moot because soon they're going to have AI robots just taking over all of our jobs who can cry on
AI
command
has
like
to have
that.
been written by somebody with the background, right, to be able to play and interpret that role. I don't want to get to that point, and I want to be able to trust actors to be able to say, this is a role. Are you able to perform it and not be, that's it.
All right. We'll talk.
With that, thank you so much for being part of this, everybody. We had a ton of fun. I had a ton of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
We cannot wait to do this live soon enough. So we're going to make that happen. Hopefully,
Eventually.
at some point.
Nothing's confirmed yet. If people
But
are
until
like,
that,
We should meet in the middle of the country, which I believe is Winnipeg. I know.
geographically
We'll figure
maybe,
it
but
out.
not spiritually. The middle of the country spiritually is Charlottetown.
I am okay with that. I love PEI.
I love you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you around.